105. That's the average age at which the oldest people ever studied. We're still living independently. Still cooking. Still walking. Still sharp. If you watched the last video on this channel, you already know the foods these people eat. This video is about everything else. Because when researchers, including the team behind the Blue Zones project, one of the most comprehensive longevity studies ever conducted, mapped what these people actually did every day. Diet wasn't the story, not even close. The habits that separated them from everyone else. The ones that appeared in every population, on every continent, across cultures with nothing else in common, were almost entirely psychological, social, and environmental. In this video, 10 of those habits. I'm saving number 1 for last. Because number 1 isn't what you'd expect. It's not a specific behavior. It's not something you can put in a morning routine. And once you understand what it actually is, you'll see why willpower was never the answer. If you want health content built on simplicity and evidence, not trends, hit subscribe. That's what this channel is. Let me give you the foundation before we get into the habits. Because context changes everything. In the early 2000s, a researcher named Dan Buettner, working with National Geographic and a team of demographers, began identifying regions where people were living, dramatically longer than the global average. Not a few years longer. Decades. He called these regions Blue Zones. The name stuck. It's now the most widely used shorthand for this research. But what matters isn't the name. It's the 5 places. Ikaria, in Greece. A small Aegean island where people regularly reach their 90s with no trace of dementia. Where heart disease rates are a fraction of what they are in the United States. Okinawa, Sardinia. A mountainous region that holds the world's highest concentration of male centenarians. The Nicoya Peninsula, Costa Rica, where people have the lowest middle-age mortality rate ever recorded in the Americas. Loma Linda, California, a community of Seventh-day Adventists who live, on average, a decade longer than the rest of the United States. Tracked for over 60 years through the Adventist Health Studies, one of the longest-running health research programs in American history. Okinawa, Japan, home to the highest concentration of centenarians ever recorded in the 20th century, where women historically outlive every other population on Earth. Different countries, different languages, different climates, different religions, different foods, different histories. But the same patterns kept appearing, the same habits, independently arrived at, across cultures that had no knowledge of each other. And here's what surprised the researchers. Diet was a factor. A real one. We'll cover it. Exercise was a factor too. We'll cover that. But neither was the dominant factor. The National Institute on Aging, which funded part of this research, estimated that genetics accounts for roughly 20 to 30% of longevity. The remaining 70 to 80%, lifestyle and environment. What these communities had, what they all had, was a way of living that their bodies were built for. A way that the modern world has, quietly and systematically, engineered out of most people's daily lives. Here are 10 of the habits that defined it. The 10 habits. 10. Natural movement. They never went to the gym. The first thing most people notice about these populations is what's missing from their lives. Gyms. None of them had gym memberships. None of them had fitness apps. None of them had exercise routines. And yet they were among the most physically capable people ever studied. What they had instead was something modern life has quietly engineered out of existence. Physical movement built into the structure of their day. Research from the Mayo Clinic found that low-intensity, continuous movement, what researchers call NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, can account for up to 50% of total daily energy expenditure and is a stronger predictor of metabolic health than structured exercise in populations that don't also sit for long periods. What this means is that an hour at the gym cannot fully compensate for 8 hours of sitting. The body wasn't designed for concentrated effort followed by prolonged stillness. It was designed to move continuously at low intensity all day. They didn't exercise to stay healthy. They lived in a way that made deliberate exercise unnecessary. 9. Eating to 80%, the practice that slows aging at a cellular level. The Okinawans have a phrase they say before meals, hara hachi biyu. It translates as, eat until you are 80% full. Not as a rule written in a health book. As a cultural habit embedded across generations, repeated at every meal by every member of the community. What's striking is that versions of this same principle appear in Sardinia, in Ikaria, in Loma Linda, across cultures that had no contact with each other. Smaller portions, slower eating, meals that ended before fullness arrived. Here's why this matters at a biological level, and it goes deeper than calories. Research from the Okinawa centenarian study, which tracked over 900 centenarians over 3 decades, found that the average caloric intake in traditional Okinawan communities was 11% below the estimated threshold for full satiety. This chronic mild caloric restriction was associated with significantly lower rates of oxidative stress, the cellular damage process most strongly linked to accelerated biological aging. They weren't restricting food as a discipline. They were eating the way their culture had always eaten. Slowly, together, until almost full. The habit wasn't control. It was a deeply embedded cultural signal to stop before the body demanded it. 8. A plant-led diet. Not vegetarian. Not vegan. More specific than either. This is the one habit on this list that is about food. So I want to be precise about it, because most people get it slightly wrong. None of these cultures were strictly vegetarian. Most of them ate meat. Some ate fish regularly. Some ate pork, chicken, goat. But meat was not the foundation of the plate. The foundation was plants. Specifically, beans and legumes, which appeared in the diets of every single long-lived population studied. Not occasionally, daily. Lentils and chickpeas in the Mediterranean. Black beans in Costa Rica. Soybeans and tofu in Okinawa. Lentils, fava beans and legume-based dishes in Ikaria. A landmark analysis published in the Asia-Pacific Journal of Clinical Nutrition, reviewing dietary data from all 5 blue zone populations, identified legume consumption as the single most consistent dietary predictor of longevity across all regions. People who ate at least 4 servings of legumes per week had significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and all-cause mortality. The mechanism is well understood. Legumes feed beneficial gut bacteria, reducing systemic inflammation. They provide slow-digesting protein that stabilizes blood glucose, without the metabolic load of large quantities of animal protein. And they are among the richest dietary sources of fiber, which is now understood to be one of the most protective nutrients in the human diet. They didn't follow a diet. They didn't track macros. They built every meal around the foods humans have relied on for most of recorded history. 7. A daily ritual of slowing down. The Sardinian finding everyone gets wrong. When this habit gets reported in the popular press, it usually gets simplified to, red wine makes you live longer. That is not what the research shows. What the research shows is this. Every afternoon, the shepherds of Ogliastra, Sardinia, would descend from the hills and gather a small glass of Cannonau wine, locally grown, high in polyphenol. Friends, conversation, laughter, an hour every day without fail. The work stopped. The stress discharged. The social bond was maintained. The wine wasn't the variable. The daily ritual of slowing down, being with people you care about, transitioning out of work and into rest, that was the variable. In Okinawa, the equivalent was the moai, a lifelong social support group, typically 5 people, who committed to each other's well-being from childhood into old age. They met, they talked, they helped each other. No wine. In Loma Linda, where the Adventist community doesn't drink at all, the equivalent was the Sabbath, 1 full day of rest, communal gathering, and deliberate separation from work each week. The Adventist Health Study 2, tracking over 96,000 participants across the United States and Canada, found that regular participation in communal religious and social gatherings was one of the strongest independent predictors of longevity in the entire dataset, even after controlling for diet, exercise, and healthcare access. The biology behind this is clear. Social connection and deliberate daily downtime directly lower cortisol, reduce inflammatory markers, and activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the state in which your body repairs itself. It wasn't the wine. It was the hour. It was the people. It was the daily decision to stop. 6. Belonging to a community, the risk factor nobody talks about. In every population researchers studied, people were embedded in a community, without exception. Not a social media network. Not a loose collection of acquaintances. A physical community, people who knew them, needed them, noticed when they were absent, and showed up when they were struggling. In Sardinia, tight-knit mountain villages where everyone knew everyone. In Okinawa, the moai, lifelong social support groups committed to each other. In Costa Rica, the deeply communal family structure of the peninsula. In Loma Linda, the Adventist faith community who gathered, served, and ate together. In Ikaria, an island so small and interconnected that social isolation was structurally almost impossible. A meta-analysis published in PLOS Medicine, reviewing data from 148 studies and over 300,000 participants across multiple countries, found that adequate social connection was associated with a 50% greater likelihood of survival at any given follow-up point. The authors concluded that the mortality risk of social isolation was comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes per day, and higher than the risk associated with obesity or physical inactivity. Let that sit for a moment. Not a minor risk. Not a lifestyle factor. A mortality risk comparable to heavy smoking. And yet loneliness has increased in almost every developed country. In every decade since the 1980s. The United States Surgeon General declared a loneliness epidemic in 2023. The United Kingdom appointed a minister for loneliness in 2018. Australia, Japan, and the European Union have all followed with national strategies. Research from Brigham Young University, published in Perspectives on Psychological Science, found that loneliness accelerates cognitive decline, suppresses immune function, disrupts sleep architecture, and increases the risk of early mortality by 26%. The same study found that the health effects of loneliness were strongest in middle age, not old age, suggesting damage accumulates for decades before it becomes visible. These communities didn't treat connection as optional, as a luxury, as something you fit in around work. They treated it as infrastructure, as necessary as food, as non-negotiable as shelter. We're halfway through the list. I still haven't told you what number 1 is. Here's what I can tell you. It's not diet. It's not exercise. It's not even belonging to a community. What it is the reason all of those things happened without any of these people trying. Stay with me. 5. Downshifting. They had stress. They had somewhere to put it. Let me be clear about something before we get into this one. These communities did not live stress-free lives. They experienced physical hardship, financial precarity, illness, grief, difficult winters, failed crops, real stress, sustained stress, the kind that marks a life. What they had that most modern people don't was a daily mechanism for stress to fully discharge. The Sardinian shepherds came home at a fixed time every day. The Okinawans had structured daily rituals of rest and social connection. The Adventists had one full day of complete rest every week. The Greeks on Ikaria napped, genuinely, regularly, mid-afternoon. A study published in the Archives of Internal Medicine tracked 23,681 adults across Greece over 6 years. After controlling for diet, physical activity, and health status, those who napped regularly, at least 3 times per week for at least 30 minutes, had a 37% lower risk of death from coronary heart disease than those who did not nap. Research from the American Institute of Stress and published reviews in psychoneuroendocrinology have demonstrated that chronic, unresolved stress keeps cortisol and inflammatory cytokines chronically elevated, which directly shortens telomeres, the protective end caps on DNA that are the most reliable biological marker of accelerated aging currently known. The damage isn't the stress itself. It's stress with nowhere to go. Stress that never fully resolves. Stress that runs as a background condition year after year. They didn't avoid difficulty. They built their days so that difficulty had an end point. 4. Faith or spiritual practice. What the data actually shows. This is the finding that makes some people uncomfortable. And I want to address that directly. The research is not arguing for the truth of any particular religion. It is documenting what having a consistent faith practice does to the human body over a lifetime. And the findings are among the most consistent in longevity research. Christianity, Buddhism, Shinto, Seventh-day Adventism. Different beliefs, different texts, different rituals. The same biological and social outcomes across all of them. A prospective cohort study published in JAMA Internal Medicine, conducted by researchers at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and tracking 74,534 women over 16 years, found that those who attended religious services at least once a week had a 33% lower risk of death from any cause compared to those who never attended. They were 5 times less likely to die from suicide, significantly less likely to die from cardiovascular disease, and reported consistently lower rates of depression and social isolation. A separate review in Social Science and Medicine, analyzing over 40 studies across multiple countries, found that regular participation in a faith community was one of the most reliable predictors of subjective well-being, life satisfaction, and longevity, independent of health behaviors and demographic factors. The mechanisms are the same ones we've already seen: belonging, structured rest, stress relief, a framework for processing difficulty, a reason to be of service, and a community that notices your absence. Faith was the container, not the miracle. What it delivered, consistently, reliably, across every culture, was a life structured around the things the body needs to stay alive. 3. Family at the center, the structural decision with the highest return. In every long-lived population, family was not something people made time for. Family was the structure inside which time happened. Grandparents in Sardinia and Ikaria didn't retire to care facilities. They lived with their families. They were expected to, not as a burden, as an asset. They cooked. They cared for children. They passed knowledge down. They sat at the center of daily life. Research on multigenerational living, including studies from the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, shows something remarkable. Grandparents who live with and help care for grandchildren have a 37% lower risk of death over any given 5-year period than grandparents who live alone. Not because they were healthier to start with, because they had a reason to stay, because they were useful, because they mattered to someone specific every single day. In Okinawa, elders were not just tolerated. They were revered, consulted. Their presence was considered protective. A household with an elder was considered a stronger household. Research published in the Journals of Gerontology found that older adults who reported feeling needed by family, by friends, by a community had significantly lower rates of disability, cognitive decline, and mortality over a 10-year follow-up compared to those who reported feeling like a burden or felt their presence was incidental. Modern culture has made a quiet decision about aging. That separation is more efficient. That generations function better apart. The evidence from every long-lived culture on Earth disagrees with that decision. Family wasn't a priority they managed around a busy life. It was the axis everything else rotated around. 2. A sense of purpose, the biological signal that tells your body to stay. The Okinawans have a word, ikigai. It translates, roughly, as the reason I wake up in the morning. Not a career goal. Not an ambition, a daily, personal, specific answer to, why does it matter that I'm here today? For a 97-year-old fisherman in Okinawa, Ikigai was making nets for local fishermen. He was still doing it at 97 because they still needed the nets. For a 103-year-old woman in Sardinia, it was being the person her grandchildren and great-grandchildren brought their problems to. For an 88-year-old in Loma Linda, it was volunteering at the food bank every Tuesday. None of these are grand purposes. All of them required another person to exist. The research on purpose and mortality is striking. A study published in JAMA Network Open, tracking over 6,000 adults across 14 years, found that people with a strong sense of purpose were 2.4 times less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. A separate analysis in psychological science found that a defined sense of purpose was associated with significantly lower risk of stroke, heart attack, and all-cause mortality. The mechanism is not purely psychological. Purpose keeps stress hormones lower. It activates the default mode network of the brain differently, sustaining cognitive function for longer. It provides a biological signal that the immune system reads as, there is still something to stay alive for. Most people in the modern world understand purpose as a career, something you achieve, or lose, or search for. The people in these cultures understood it as something much simpler, being genuinely needed by someone specific every day. 1. The right environment. Alright, number 1. I told you at the start that number 1 isn't something most people would put on a list like this. That it's not a specific behavior. That it's not something you can put in a morning routine. Here's what the researchers noticed after years of studying these populations. None of them had intentionally built a longevity lifestyle. Not one of them was trying to live long. They weren't following a plan. They weren't tracking anything. They weren't making daily decisions to move more, eat better, connect more, rest more. They were just living the way they'd always lived, in the place they'd always lived, in the way their community had always lived. What made the difference wasn't discipline. It wasn't willpower. It wasn't knowledge. It was their environment. Every habit on this list, the natural movement, the plant-led diet, the daily ritual of slowing down, the belonging, the purpose, the family structure, the faith, was built into the environment they lived in. The Sardinian shepherd walked miles every day because walking was how you reached the sheep, not because he had a fitness goal. The Okinawan woman ate mostly plants because that's what was in the garden, not because she'd read a nutrition study. The Greek islander was surrounded by community every day, because the island was small and isolation was structurally almost impossible, not because she had scheduled social time. The healthy behavior was the default, not the exception, not the effort, the only available option. This concept has a name in behavioral economics: choice architecture. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, whose work on this subject earned Thaler the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017, demonstrated that the structure of an environment determines the behavior of the people inside it far more powerfully than their intentions, beliefs, or knowledge. When healthy choices are the default option, people make them automatically. When unhealthy choices are the default, the same is true. Brian Wansink's research at Cornell University on food environments found that simply changing the physical arrangement of food, what's visible, what's accessible, what's the default serving size, altered consumption patterns dramatically, without people being aware of the influence or making any conscious decision. Now here's the part that matters most. The part that's hardest to hear. The modern environment does the opposite. It is engineered at almost every level for sedentary behavior. Drive-thrus, delivery apps, escalators, parking lots at every door. Ultra-processed food as the cheapest, most accessible, most visible option. Screens that replace the physical presence of other people. Workdays with no defined end. Careers that demand everything and communities that offer nothing back. Generations separated into different postcodes, different care systems, different lives. You cannot willpower your way out of an environment built against you. That's the thing the health industry doesn't want you to understand. Because if the problem is the environment, the solution is not a product. The solution is not a supplement, a routine, an app, a subscription. The solution is changing the environment, even imperfectly, even in one small way. So here's the only question that matters when you finish this video. What is one thing you can change about your environment this week? Not your habits, your environment. That makes one of these things more automatic and less effortful. Can you change what food is visible in your kitchen? Can you walk somewhere you currently drive? Can you create a fixed time every day where work stops and people begin? Can you identify one person who genuinely needs you in a specific way? Small changes to the structure of a day compound into a different life. Not because you tried harder. Because the environment stopped working against you. That is what the longest-lived people on Earth understood. Not how to live longer. How to build an environment their body was designed to thrive inside. I want to say one thing clearly before we finish. None of this means you need to move to Sardinia. You can't replicate a mountain village. You can't undo decades of industrial design before your next meal. That's not the point. The point is to stop looking for the answer in places that have never held it. These people lived past 100 without knowing they were doing anything special. Without supplements. Without biohacking. Without morning routines they'd optimized. Without subscriptions. Without tracking. They moved because the day required it. They ate real food because it was what was available. They rested because their culture demanded it. They were connected because their community made isolation almost impossible. They had purpose because people around them genuinely needed them. None of that required a single product. The health industry has spent decades telling you that the answer is something you haven't bought yet, something you haven't optimized yet, something you're not disciplined enough to maintain yet. The evidence from the longest-lived humans ever studied tells a different story. The answer isn't discipline. The answer isn't information. The answer is environment. Build a life where the right choice is the one that requires no choice at all. That's what they had. That's what's available to you. Before you close this video, which of these habits do you already have in your life? And which one feels the furthest away? Drop both answers in the comments. Not for me, for you. Research from New York University's psychology department has shown that naming a specific intention publicly significantly increases the probability of following through on it. The comment is the first step. If this video gave you a different way of thinking about your health, not just information but a new frame, subscribe. That's what every video on this channel is built to do. The next video looks at sleep. Specifically, what the people in these same communities did differently between sunset and sunrise. Not supplements. Not devices. Not white noise. Something about the structure of their evenings that almost no one in the modern world still does. And the research on what it does to the brain over a lifetime is one of the most striking things I've come across in making this series. That one is next.